It was just another busy morning in the courthouse, but no one expected what was about to unfold. A respected judge, known for her fairness and wisdom, sat behind the bench, ready to hear the next case. The room was filled with quiet murmurs as people settled into their seats. Then, the doors swung open, and in walked a police officer, his uniform crisp, his presence commanding. But something about his expression was off. The moment he saw who was presiding over the case, his steps slowed. His eyes narrowed. The judge was black. A flicker of defiance crossed his face, and instead of walking to his designated spot, he hesitated. Whispers rippled through the courtroom. Everyone could feel the tension thickening in the air. The judge lifted her chin, her voice steady yet firm. "Officer, please take your position." Silence. Then, to everyone's shock, the officer shook his head. He refused to stand before her. Gasps echoed around the room. People exchanged stunned glances. The judge remained calm, her gaze unwavering. "Officer, this is a court of law. Step forward." What happened next left everyone speechless. Instead of complying, the officer did something unthinkable. With a swift movement, he lashed out, his foot connecting in an act of pure disrespect. The courtroom erupted in chaos. But just seconds later, before he could even register what he had done, karma struck. And it struck hard. Meanwhile, across town, another story was unfolding, one of kindness, one of hope. A young black teenager sat on a crowded bus, his headphones in, lost in thought. The bus jolted to a stop, and an exhausted pregnant woman stepped inside, scanning the packed rows for a seat. Before she could even sigh in frustration, the boy was already on his feet. "Here, ma'am, take my seat," he offered with a warm smile. The woman's eyes softened with gratitude as she eased down, catching her breath. "Thank you, sweetheart," she murmured. She reached into her bag, hesitated for a second, then pulled out a small folded note. Pressing it into his hand, she whispered, "Read this later." Curious, the teen tucked it into his pocket without thinking much of it. Little did he know, the words written inside would change his life forever. But what did the note say? And what exactly happened to the officer in the courtroom just moments after his shocking act? Stay tuned, because what unfolds next will leave you speechless. The courtroom was frozen in shock. Gasps and murmurs filled the space as the officer stood there, his face a mix of defiance and something else, perhaps realization. The judge, steady and composed, pushed herself up from where she had stumbled, her robe shifting as she straightened her posture. She didn't say a word at first, but her eyes locked onto the officer with a piercing intensity. The bailiff moved quickly, stepping toward the officer, but the judge raised her hand slightly, stopping him. She wanted to handle this herself. The officer, breathing heavily, clenched his fists. His whole body was tense, as if bracing for whatever would come next. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, people whispering among themselves, unable to believe what had just happened. The judge inhaled slowly, steadying herself, then spoke, her voice calm yet unshakable. "Officer, do you realize what you have just done?" The room fell silent again. The officer's jaw tightened. He was a man who had spent years commanding respect, used to being the authority in any room he walked into. But now, under the judge's steady gaze, something in his posture wavered. His eyes darted around as if searching for support, but he found none. The courtroom, filled with attorneys, clerks, and spectators, was now his jury, and they were all waiting to see what would happen next. Meanwhile, across town, the young teenager sat quietly on the bus, the note still tucked inside his pocket. He had almost forgotten about it, too caught up in the rhythm of the moving city, the passing lights, the quiet conversations happening around him. His thoughts drifted back to the woman he had given his seat to. There had been something in her eyes, a mix of gratitude and something deeper, something almost knowing. As the bus came to a stop near his neighborhood, he finally pulled the note out and unfolded it. His eyes scanned the words quickly, then slowed. His heart pounded. He read it again. For a moment, he just sat there, gripping the small piece of paper, his mind racing. He looked around as if expecting to see the woman again, but of course, she was gone. He swallowed hard, feeling the weight of whatever he had just been given. The note wasn't just a thank you, it was something bigger. Something that could change everything. Back in the courthouse, the tension only thickened. The judge stepped forward, each movement deliberate. She refused to let the moment break her, refused to let the act of disrespect shake her authority. But she wasn't just thinking about herself. She was thinking about everyone in that room, everyone watching. The officer, still standing rigid, seemed to be at war with himself. His emotions flickered across his face, but he said nothing. The judge finally spoke again. "Officer, I am asking you one last time. Will you stand before this court and show the respect that is expected in this institution of law?" Another long pause. The courtroom held its breath. Then, without a word, the officer turned on his heel and walked away. The room erupted. People gasped, others whispered furiously. A police officer, sworn to uphold the law, had just walked out on a judge. It was unheard of. The bailiff glanced at the judge, waiting for her command, but she simply watched the officer go. She could have had him detained. She could have made an example out of him. But she knew that some lessons weren't taught with force. They were taught by letting consequences unfold on their own. And she had a feeling that karma was already on its way. The teen, still clutching the note, stepped off the bus and walked toward home, his mind racing. He could still hear the woman's voice, the way she had whispered, "Read this later," as if she had known exactly what kind of reaction he would have. The words on the paper burned in his mind. He needed to figure out what they meant. He just had no idea that this small note would lead him to something much, much bigger than he could have ever imagined. The teen's footsteps felt heavier with each step. The note, still gripped in his hand, seemed to burn against his skin. He had read it over and over, but the words didn't change. They only became more real. His heart pounded as he turned the corner toward his house, the streetlights flickering above him. His mother would be home soon, probably asking about his day, but he wasn't sure how to explain any of this. He unfolded the paper once more under the dim glow of a street lamp. The handwriting was neat, precise, almost like it had been written with deep thought. But it wasn't just what it said, it was the weight behind the words. The message was simple, yet it held something deeper, something that made his stomach twist. Your kindness won't go unnoticed. There are things you don't know yet, but you will soon. Be ready. It made no sense, yet at the same time, it felt like it meant everything. Who is this woman? And how could she possibly know something about him that he didn't? His mind raced with possibilities. Was this some kind of prank? A mistake? But no, she had looked at him with intention. She had known exactly what she was doing when she pressed the note into his hand. As he stepped inside his house, he barely noticed the usual sounds of home, the low hum of the television, the distant sound of cars passing outside. He moved automatically, dropping his backpack by the couch, but his mind wasn't here. It was still back on that bus, still caught in the mystery of the note. Meanwhile, across town, the courtroom was still buzzing with what had just happened. The officer's departure had left behind a strange, unsettled energy. People whispered in hushed tones, some shaking their heads in disbelief. The judge remained at her bench, her expression unreadable, but inside, she was processing every detail. She had spent years in this profession, seen countless cases, witnessed moments of raw human emotion. But this was something else. It wasn't just about disrespect. It was deeper than that. It was a mindset, a belief, an unspoken statement that the officer had made with his actions. She took a slow breath, her fingers tapping lightly on the desk in front of her. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Outside the courthouse, the officer walked briskly, his pulse pounding. His mind was a storm of emotions, anger, defiance, and something else he didn't want to admit. A sinking feeling in his gut told him he had just made a mistake, one he couldn't easily undo. He reached his patrol car, gripping the door handle tightly. The world around him felt too loud. The honking cars, the chatter of pedestrians, the weight of his own thoughts pressing down on him. He had let his emotions take over in that moment, but now that it was done, he wasn't sure what came next. What he didn't realize was that someone had seen everything. Someone who had been watching from the shadows, unnoticed, yet fully aware. And that someone had plans. Back at home, the teen sat at the edge of his bed, staring at the note like it might suddenly explain itself. He thought about the woman again, her tired eyes, the way she had held onto her belly protectively, how she had looked at him like she already knew something about him that he didn't. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't random. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. A text from his best friend. "Yo, you good? You left school quick today." He hesitated, then typed back, "Yeah, just weird day." He didn't know how to explain it yet. He wasn't even sure if he believed it himself. But deep down, something told him that his life had just taken a turn. And whatever was coming next, he wasn't sure he was ready for it. The night felt heavier than usual. The teen lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the note still clutched in his hand. He had read it so many times that he could see the words even when he closed his eyes. Be ready. Ready for what? What was he supposed to do? He had been raised to believe that kindness was simple. You did the right thing because it was right, not because you expected anything in return. But now, it felt like there was something bigger at play, something he couldn't see yet. His phone buzzed again. Another text, this time from an unknown number. "Did you read the note?" His breath caught. His fingers tightened around the device. He sat up, heart racing. This couldn't be real. He hesitated before typing back. "Who is this?" No response. He stared at the screen, willing it to light up again, to give him some kind of answer. But nothing came. The seconds dragged on, each one making his pulse pound louder in his ears. Somewhere across the city, the officer sat alone in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The weight of what had happened in that courtroom sat heavy on his chest. The judge's eyes, unwavering and full of something he couldn't quite name, haunted him. He had made his choice, acted on impulse, but now, sitting here in the silence of the night, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like something else. His radio crackled. A call coming in. He reached for it, but before he could respond, there was a knock on his window. He turned sharply. A figure stood just outside, barely visible in the dim streetlights. The officer hesitated before rolling down the window an inch. "What do you want?" His voice came out gruff, defensive. The figure leaned slightly closer. "You think you walked away today, but you didn't. You set something in motion." The officer's grip tightened on the wheel. "Who are you?" No answer. Just a slow, knowing smile before the person turned and disappeared into the shadows. The officer's pulse thundered in his ears. He threw open the door, stepping out quickly, scanning the street. But the figure was gone. Back in his bedroom, the teen was still gripping his phone when another message finally came through. "It's time to meet. Tomorrow. Same bus, same time. Don't be late." He swallowed hard. His mind screamed at him to ignore it, to pretend this wasn't happening. But deep down, he already knew he couldn't. Something had started. Something big. And there was no going back now. The next morning, the teen's hands felt clammy as he gripped the metal pole inside the bus. He had barely slept. His mind had been racing, replaying the text message over and over. "It's time to meet." Who was this person? And why him? The words from the note still lingered in his mind. There are things you don't know yet. He scanned the passengers, his eyes searching for a familiar face, hers. But the pregnant woman wasn't there. Instead, the bus felt eerily normal. People scrolling through their phones, the driver focused on the road, the city moving past in a blur. Then he noticed it. A man sitting near the back, wearing a dark jacket, watching him. Not in an obvious way, but just enough to make his skin prickle. The man wasn't looking at his phone, wasn't distracted. He was just sitting there, waiting. The bus jolted to a stop. A few people got off. The teen's heart pounded. He had no idea what he was supposed to do. But before he could make a decision, the man in the jacket stood up and moved toward him. "You got the note," the man said, his voice low, steady. The teen took a small step back, suddenly aware of how fast his breathing had become. "Who are you?" "Not here," the man muttered, glancing around. "Next stop. Get off." The bus lurched forward again, but all the teen could hear was the pounding in his chest. Every instinct pulled him to stay put, to pretend none of this was happening. But something deep inside told him he had to know. As the next stop approached, he forced himself to move, stepping off the bus just behind the man. The street was quieter here, away from the morning rush. A row of old buildings lined the sidewalk, their windows reflecting the rising sun. The man turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "You were never supposed to get that note," he said. The teen frowned. "What do you mean?" "She gave it to me." The man exhaled, glancing over his shoulder as if checking for something. "She wasn't supposed to. She made a choice." The words sent a chill through him. "Who is she?" The man hesitated. "Someone who's trying to change things." He looked at the teen, really looked at him like he was trying to measure something. "You did something good. And now you're in the middle of something bigger than you realize." The teen swallowed. "What does that mean? Bigger how?" But before the man could answer, a car screeched to a stop across the street. Two men stepped out. Their eyes locked onto them immediately. The man in the jacket tensed. "We need to go. Now." The teen barely had time to react before the man grabbed his arm, pulling him into a narrow alley. His heart pounded as he ran, feet slamming against the pavement. He had no idea what was happening, but one thing was clear. Whoever those men were, they weren't here to talk. Somewhere across the city, the officer sat in his patrol car, gripping the wheel, still rattled from the night before. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Something he couldn't stop. And he had no idea that, at this very moment, his path was about to collide with the boys in a way that would change everything. The teen's breath came in sharp gasps as he ran, his mind spinning with fear and confusion. The man in the jacket gripped his arm, pulling him through the twisting alleyways, past dumpsters and rusted fire escapes. Footsteps pounded behind them. Whoever those men were, they weren't giving up. They burst out onto a main street, the sudden light blinding for a second. The teen barely had time to register his surroundings before the man shoved him forward. "Keep moving. Don't stop." A car screeched around the corner. The same one from before. Panic surged through him. But just as the car closed in, a different set of flashing lights flooded the street. A police cruiser. The teen's heart nearly stopped. The officer from the courtroom stepped out. His hand hovered near his holster, eyes locked onto the two men chasing them. The tension in the air was electric. The men hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then they bolted. The officer didn't chase them. He didn't have to. Instead, his gaze shifted to the teen and the man beside him. "Someone want to tell me what's going on?" His voice was controlled, but there was an edge to it. The teen swallowed, still trying to catch his breath. He didn't even know where to start. But the man beside him, his unexpected guide in all of this, spoke first. "You don't realize it yet, but you're part of this, too." The officer stiffened. "Part of what?" The man reached into his pocket, slowly, making sure not to startle the officer. He pulled out a second note, one that looked almost identical to the one the teen had received. The officer hesitated before taking it. He unfolded the paper and read the words. "Your choices define you. But now, it's time to fix what's broken." His face paled. The teen watched, confused. "What does it mean?" The officer didn't answer at first. His grip on the note tightened. Finally, he looked at the man in the jacket. "Who gave this to you?" The man's expression remained unreadable. "Same person who gave it to him," he said, nodding toward the teen. The officer's jaw clenched. "That's impossible." But before the teen could ask why, another voice cut through the air. A voice that sent a shiver down his spine. "I told you. There are things you don't know yet." The teen turned and his breath caught. The pregnant woman from the bus stood just a few feet away. But she wasn't pregnant anymore. The teen's mind reeled. He had just seen her days ago. How could this be possible? The woman's eyes met his, full of something he couldn't quite name. Sadness? Hope? A mix of both? "You weren't supposed to get involved," she said gently. But now that you have, you deserve the truth. The officer stepped forward, his face pale. Who are you? The woman exhaled. Someone who tried to change the course of things before it was too late. She looked at the teen. And someone who knew that one act of kindness could set everything in motion. The teen's head spun. The note. The messages. The chase. It all led to this moment. But before he could speak, the woman gave him a small, knowing smile. Be ready. And just like that, she turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving more questions than answers. The teen stood frozen, his mind racing as he watched the woman vanish into the crowd. His chest felt tight, like the weight of everything that had happened was suddenly pressing down on him all at once. The note, the messages, the chase, none of it made sense, yet at the same time it all felt connected. He turned to the officer, whose face had lost all its usual sternness. Instead, there was something else there, recognition, maybe even regret. The officer still held the second note, his fingers gripping it so tightly that the edges crumpled. He wasn't saying anything, just staring at the spot where the woman had stood, as if trying to process something only he understood. The man in the jacket let out a slow breath. You remember now, don't you? His voice was calm, but carried weight. You know who she is. The officer's jaw tightened. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, with effort, he exhaled and nodded. The teen's heart pounded. Who is she? He asked, his voice quieter than he expected. The officer finally turned to him. His eyes, once filled with cold authority, now carried something softer, something human. She's someone I let down a long time ago, he admitted. And she's giving me a second chance to fix it. The words hung in the air. The teen didn't know what to say. The woman had seemed like a stranger, yet somehow she was tied to all of this, tied to him, to the officer, to everything that had happened over the past few days. The officer looked down at the note one last time before slipping it into his pocket. Then he glanced at the teen. Come on, I'll take you home. The teen hesitated, then nodded. He didn't understand everything, but he understood enough to know that something had shifted. Something had changed in the officer, in the way he carried himself. The ride back was quiet, the only sound coming from the occasional crackle of the police radio. The teen stared out the window, his mind still full of questions. He thought about the woman's last words to him. Be ready. Ready for what? When they pulled up to his house, the officer put the car in park but didn't speak right away. After a few seconds, he turned to the teen. What you did on that bus, that was the kind of thing that changes people, he said. Maybe you don't see it now, but it mattered. It mattered more than you know. The teen swallowed. I just gave up my seat. The officer shook his head. No. You did more than that. You reminded someone that kindness still exists. And sometimes, that's enough to change the course of everything. The words settled deep in the teen's chest. He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. As he stepped out of the car, the officer called after him. Hey. The teen turned back. The officer hesitated, then said, Thank you. The teen didn't answer, but he didn't need to. He just nodded again, then shut the door and walked up to his house. That night, he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling just as he had the night before. But this time, he didn't feel confused. He felt something else. Something he couldn't quite name. Maybe he would never understand exactly what had happened. Maybe he would never see the woman again, or learn the full truth behind the notes. But he knew one thing, his life wasn't the same. And somehow he was okay with that. Because maybe, just maybe, this was only the beginning.